for my functional area presentation, I decided to focus on financial aid. The reason why I chose this specific area was because I talk a lot about financial aid, more scholarships, but still a lot of students and their families ask about financial aid, and especially seniors, they ask about their award letter. So I do know a little bit about financial aid. But also, I was really interested in, this is my, I guess, B, was how it really was created. I'm not really familiar. I just know that it affects me and a lot of my peers, and I went to college and still affects them to this day, about student loan, and especially students who weren't very knowledgeable about the process of getting loans. So while I was doing my research, I found an excellent article, and this is included in the quote on the first slide. Financial aid is increasingly driven by political priorities rather than student need or merit. I think this is a really good quote, and I wanted to start it at the beginning. So as I'm talking about the history of financial aid and then kind of the current issues that are kind of going along with it, how financial aid at the beginning started off as a really good idea, but has since transformed into something that is really a hot topic that affects a lot of students, and there's a lot of debates about how students can deal with student debt in the U.S. So to kind of begin, I want to start with a little bit of the history of financial aid, going from like the colonial period up until World War II, not quite when it ended. First, most students who attended colleges at the beginning were very well off, very able to afford going to college, and it wasn't necessarily always just for earning an actual degree, as we talked about in class before. So really, when the socioeconomic makeup of students who wanted to attend universities started to change, there wasn't a lot of funding from the university for students, and really funding for the universities themselves. So a lot of wealthy local patrons created a lot of endowed scholarships or charitable funds for students who had the ability, but they just didn't have the monetary funds. And this started at Harvard, and it really moved on into William and Mary, Yale, Princeton, University of Pennsylvania, and quite a few others, but these are just a few that were really mentioned in the article. And I found this really interesting because, again, it was created to help people, first and foremost, but also it was from local contributions. It wasn't from an overlying body, it was from local people who could actually contribute to the cause. In 1838, Harvard created the General Beneficiary Fund, which is about the earliest that I read, that was very similar to kind of like an overall agency or an overall control over receiving and giving loans. And it was 0% interest loans, but again, the main people who created this fund were wealthy alumni and benefactors, whether they be local or, again, alumni who had attended and had left and they wanted to help out for charity. And I'm bringing this up again because there's a few other opportunities for charity and a lot of contributions to a lot of the funding of founding universities. But really, there was a big kind of idea about financial assistance for military men. And this relates to where financial aid really starts to pick up the pace on the next slide. So it has been part of history since the Revolutionary War that military vets, specifically men, would receive some type of aid for the government for, protecting and fighting for the country. However, there were a lot of protests over unpaid benefits after World War I. So there was all this talk about compensation and helping students to receive, whether it be land or financial assistance from the government. And they really did get upset, and they actually marched in 1932. And from these bonus marchers, they really struck a chord with the president, who eventually would pass the next bill that would really actually finance assistance for military men. And this would be the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, or also known as the GI Bill. So President Roosevelt wanted to avoid a second bonus march. He didn't want all these men, and there were women, but specifically men benefited from this more so, that would come back upset from actually, going to war and protecting the nation and not receiving any assistance. This really set the precedent for governmental financial assistance. The biggest reason was the government didn't realize how popular it would be, so it really spread like wildfire. They could choose for educational assistance or to get land, but again, they didn't think that it was going to be as popular as it was. And it did, again, because of its popularity, it's the precedent which really transformed higher education and student affairs, because no longer were people assuming they had to pay for it on their own or from local patrons or charity. They could possibly get financial assistance from the government to pay for their education. This kind of continued on, there was a lot of talk, and the biggest thing that came out that related specifically to financial aid was written in the Higher Education Act of 1965, and then it was revised again in 1972 and quite a few years after that. But this really cemented the federal government's involvement in education. It provided a guaranteed loan program, and it really started off and connects to the other reauthorization acts with Stafford and Pell Grants, all the different things that we're very familiar with today in financial aid. It basically set a charter for today's financial aid system. So the Senator Edith Green, who put this forth, it talked a little bit more about the stipulations students should be receiving for aid, and it kind of went in depth as it got reauthorized throughout the years, and it really did change from what we saw in 65 and 72 to what we have now. So what are the roles of financial aid transitioning and kind of linking the history to what we have at Grand Valley? Students to receive aid need to fill out the free application for financial student aid, or shortened to FAFSA. It's based solely on the tax information from your parents or your guardians, if applicable. And this basically sifts through what your estimated family contribution is, or your EFC, to see what you would be eligible for grants that you do not have to pay back, and different loan eligibility, which would be needs-based. So sometimes it's subsidized, sometimes it's unsubsidized, and the financial aid is in charge of sending these award letters to students so they know what they are receiving. My contact who works in financial aid at Grand Valley said one of the biggest concerns with students and their parents about financial aid is how they can afford college when the parent isn't qualified for a Parent Plus loan, which is one of the opportunities. And this usually affects the middle class family. So a lot of times students, who are very much needs-based and they need the aid, whether it be for grants or for loans, they may receive it and still struggle. But even middle class families, based on their estimated family contribution, puts them above a specific level, which means they may or may not be qualified as Parent Plus loan. So for these students, they might still have a small or large balance after they receive all these loans. So it's kind of figuring out what other opportunities are out there to receive aid. And this is where other options come. So those outside loans, which might have very high interest rates, you have to have a co-signer. This is where a lot of students get into trouble with a lot of debt and trying to pay it back. Another role that Grand Valley and other financial aid offices have would be managing additional scholarships. So the office here at Grand Valley is the Office of Financial Aid and Scholarship. So not only are they dealing with FAFSA, they're dealing with a 400 plus database that shows different scholarship opportunities for students. Now, it's interesting because some of these scholarships, they don't require the FAFSA, but for quite a few of them, there might be needs-based eligibility requirements. So students still have to fill out the FAFSA. We always recommend it even in my office because you don't have to take loans, but you can if you want to. And for some of the actual scholarship eligibilities, they have to show that they filled out the financial aid. They have so many different scholarships that they have to review that they do run the database and keep it up to date, but they also designate financial aid counselors as well as voluntarily GVSU employees to review scholarships. I'm actually one of the employees who reviews scholarships, and these scholarships really vary. Some of them are based on what high school you attended. That's the one I'm reviewing, and another one is just a general communications scholarship. So really it does vary, but I always thought it was very interesting that FAFSA is still related to these other scholarships, so they still have to fill out all the information. And another role that financial aid has at GVSU is that they educate. Not only are they the point of contact for students who are filling out the FAFSA, if they need to fill in additional forms or if the university needs it, they break down everything and give them award letters, but they also educate the community. So they go in the west side and on the east side to different communities, sometimes different centers and high schools, and they just educate the students and families about financial aid. This is really important, especially for first generation students who their parents aren't familiar with loans. And this is even more helpful for a lot of families that I meet with. The parents lived in a different era for financial aid opportunities, and they don't understand that the cost of going to school now is quite different than it used to be in the past. I'm going to break off at this point and then add it on to the other for the current issues in politics and financial aid.